What's up, everyone? I'm back for another tournament review. This time I'm going to be reviewing my performance in the Charlotte Open Online, which took place January 9th through 10th over the weekend before last. It's already been a while, so it's about time I get to reviewing this. And as opposed to the last review that I did, this tournament went a lot better for me. And I'm going to take you through some of the games, some of the key moments. I don't want this video to be too long, so I'm going to try to stick to about 5 minutes per game. There's 6 games. It was a 6-round tournament, and I don't want to make this video more than 30 minutes, so let's get to it. So this is the under 2000 section. I was the second ranked player in my section out of about 50 to 60 people, and so obviously my expectations are pretty high. I was trying to win the thing or at least place in the top 3, and time control was classical, 75 plus 10. So quite a decent chunk of time to think, but still there were quite a few games that went down to the wire. So in the first round, I played someone whose rating was about 1740, and I decided to play the modern defense, e4 g6, which is something I play more in blitz, but I decided to test it in a classical game. And he went for kind of the 150 attack style setup with bishop e3, queen d2, going for an immediate long castle, and trying to exchange off my powerful bishop. And I'm going for this queenside kind of advances with the pawn. So he trades off my bishop. And here he already made kind of an inaccurate move. He played bishop d3. The reason this isn't so good is because he's putting his bishop behind this pawn. And now after I play e5, now the bishop is like a tall pawn. I mean, he can't really see. He pushes here to keep the center closed. But now I just developed my knight, and now I can simply jump into here and start pushing these pawns. So White's plan in these openings is to try to attack on the king side, and he does that by playing h4. But I just play h5 and stop him from advancing. So he just kind of continues his development, as do I. And now I'm already starting to create some attack on the queen side, forcing him back, bringing my rook in. He played b3 here, which was not necessary, but he was a little bit startled, I guess, by my advances. And now he played knight f2. I go a4, and now this is where he decided to launch his own attack. I mean, he's not going to sit back and just wait for me to kind of advance my pawns. I was even thinking of a way to play like c6 and sacrifice, and just to bring my queen into the game. But here he launched his own attack and played this move g4. Which is a pawn sacrifice. I mean, I can actually take here and win the pawn, and I did take, but now he played a clever move, h5. Instead of taking, he's now pushing, allowing me to take a second pawn, but his goal is to try to open the h-file, where his rook is going to be powerful. Potentially, he can have his queen coming in. I basically just called his bluff and took a second pawn, but now he took here. And it looks like I can take his knight, but this is where I have to now be careful, because if I do that, we'll then suddenly check and mate. So I can't take, I have to take with the pawn, and now he moves his knight. So he sacrificed 2 pawns. I'm actually up 2 pawns in this position, but my king is starting to look a little bit unsafe. I mean, he's going to bring his rook over. He can already make this check if he wants to. So I have to be cautious myself. I took here, and now played bishop d7, which was a little bit slow, but I wanted to at least get some development. I mean, my pieces are still kind of sitting back here, having not really moved yet. And so he played rook hg1 here, or rook dg1 rather. He's bringing his rook to the open, semi-open, I should say, g-file, and already threatening some potential moves like knight f5 check. And here I was already getting relatively low on time. We both were, and I decided to try to throw him off because I saw that he was threatening this check, so I decided to take his bishop in the hopes that he would take with his queen, as he did. And now he no longer has this move, so now I jumped in with knight g4. And my idea is to try to exchange off some pieces and kind of slow down his attack. And he took, and now he was getting very low on time here, and he kind of panicked. What he could have done was brought his queen back and then still threatened to come here, after which I would have to like stop it with rook h8. But then he could probably just trade and then bring his other rook in and do something like this, and I would still have to be very careful. But he kind of just went all out in this position and sacrificed the knight, which maybe look like it might work, but really it doesn't, because I take, and now he takes, and he has my bishop in a pin. Obviously, he can't take back because my king is on g7. But I play rook f4, and now suddenly my bishop is defended. I have a very nice grasp over the square. So really, he has no breakthrough, and he had like less than a minute, so he just went for a desperate attempt with queen takes f3, giving up the queen for a couple rook checks. But eventually, I got my king to safety, and it's pretty much game over. I mean, I'm up a queen. He kind of danced around a little bit, tried to give some more checks, hoping for maybe like some kind of a perpetual, but eventually I brought my queen in and found this nice way to force a resignation. Rook a2 check, and the point is, if he takes, then I actually take here, and this is mate. So he resigned. I mean, he played pretty well, but I always kind of was safe. I was never in that much danger. I always had a decent kind of grasp on his attack. And I mean, sometimes that's what you got to do, especially when you play the modern defense. People are going to attack you, and you just have to defend. So moving on to round two. So in round two, I was up against a slightly higher rated opponent, about 1800, young kid. And I opened with e4, and he played the Sicilian Najdorf. And I decided to go for the Adams attack, h3, a move that I've been kind of experimenting with lately. And the idea is to get some kingside advances. And in this case, I even just go for g5, kicking his knight back. And I'm gaining a lot of space on the king side in the hopes of starting a quick attack. And so he goes here, and now he castles. And already, I mean, if I was black here, I would be a little bit scared to castle, because these advanced pawns, if they just keep pushing, potentially black could be in some trouble. And so here, the funny thing was I made kind of an accurate move. If this was just a blitz game and I wasn't really thinking, I would just play queen d2. But I was trying to be like sort of clever, and I played queen e2, which according to the engine is a mistake, but practically it doesn't make much of a difference. I thought that the queen being here could have a better chance of kind of going to the king side, and also potentially after queen d2 he has some ideas where he goes knight e5 and threatens to make this fork. So I played queen e2, and he develops on the queen side after trading. I kind of stop his advances. He goes bishop e7, and here I played f4. And my idea was to further support this pawn, so I could start pushing this pawn and use my pawns to kind of break the structure in front of this king, and that'll give me some targets to attack. And in this position, he thought for a minute or two and played the move f5. And this move kind of threw me off at first because it looks good for black. What it's doing is working on the fact that this pin exists, right? If I take, then my rook can fall. And, well, if I don't take, then he's threatening to kind of bust up my center and open his rook. But the more I looked at this, the more I realized that this is a mistake from him. And I thought for about 20 minutes or so, maybe even more, because I was trying to find the most precise way to kind of punish his carelessness. And when I was fully ready and sure of my plan, I actually called his bluff and took the pawn. Hanging my rook, he can actually take, but if he does, then what I do is take on e6, it's a check now, and if he moves his king, I take the bishop, and now I'm threatening mate. And if he defends, I go f6, and he's practically lost because his knight can't move. He's in this pin, and I'm just building an insane amount of pressure against this pawn. But if he blocks with rook f7, then I have g6, and now his rook is pinned, and he's losing that rook. I gave up mine, but he's going to lose his, and he's still going to be under attack. So he can't really take the rook, but what he played was e5, and this is a move that I also had to calculate and know what I was going to do here, because now my bishop is under attack and my rook is still hanging. But now I played bishop g2, and it looks like, wait, can he take the bishop? And he did take. But now here comes knight d5, creating a fork against his queen and bishop, blocking this. So he takes, and now check. And also I should mention, what would have actually happened had he not taken this bishop, but had taken this bishop first? Because here there's also a cool line that goes like this. I take the bishop, allowing him to take, and now the same fork. And after his queen goes back, the move I was planning to play was f6, based on the fact that my queen is lined up with his king. But then I realized there's an even stronger move that I would have had here, which is rook to e1. And now there's all this pressure against the bishop. If he tries to defend, well, then I can still just take. And after takes, he actually can't take me here because I pick off his rook. So everything in this variation kind of just comes together nicely, and he's in big trouble. And in the game, he took the bishop, and now I take, and now even though I'm temporarily down a piece, I have him in this fork, and his bishop is hanging, and after he moves, I take the rook, and then take the bishop. So after this entire wild sequence, I come out up in exchange. I have a rook for a knight, and I have all these very dangerous pawns here that I'm going to use to storm his king side, and he's already in huge trouble. I mean, he played rook c8, trying to threaten checkmate, but I just defended. Move the rook out of danger. He plays knight c5, hoping for a little trick with knight b3, but I just sidestep. And now he plays this move, but I just don't even flinch. I just play f6. And now I'm actually the one threatening mate. He has to defend with his queen. And now I could have traded queens and just won a nice endgame, but I decided to make it even simpler, f7. Now threatening to promote. He trades, has to go here to stop the pawn. And now, I mean, I could have won this game in a number of ways. I simply played b4, forcing his knight back. And now he actually went to d7, because if he went somewhere here, then I can just play this move. And there's actually no way for him to save the rook. If he takes, I promote, and that's mate. And I mean, if he plays this move, then I just take. So he actually gave up his knight, I took, and I mean, the rest of the game is just a smooth conversion, trade of rooks. I went back here, pushed this, and he resigned, because after he takes the pawn, I'm just going to push this guy, make a queen, and it's going to be checkmate. So that was a pretty nice victory. Relatively simple, but it just kind of shows what happens when one player makes kind of tactical threats on just the surface level with his move f5, and another player just actually thinks deeply and sees through it all. So now we're on to round 3, actually the last round of day 1, and I was up against the highest rated player I'd faced yet, also on 2 out of 2 points, and against him I went for my more kind of main repertoire, and he played f4, a very aggressive kind of approach against it, but now I counter in the center with e5. And he already started to think for a while because he wasn't very familiar with this position, and played bishop c4. And now I take and play c6. And it looks like, what am I doing? I have very little space. But this was already kind of throwing him off, and here he tried to really force things by playing e5, which is a mistake because now I take, and it looks like I have to move the knight, but here I have a very important intermezzo, in-between move, bishop c5, creating a more serious threat than the one against my knight by attacking his queen, forcing him to move here. He has to stay close to protect his pawn, and now I play queen e7, and I don't have to move the knight because I'm pinning the pawn now. He can't take. He has to defend it. Now I castle. And now I bring my bishop back, and suddenly he actually can't save the pawn because I have 3 attackers on it. He can't create another defender, so he castles and I win the pawn. And just like that, 12 moves in, I'm up a pawn. But now here comes a bunch of pressure. I'm behind in development, so what he's going to do is create some pressure with his rooks and kind of his open files, like this one. He's got this bishop, so I have to be very careful, and I had to kind of counterattack very precisely. Here I played knight g4, trying to trade off the queens. He just played rook f1, clever move, because now if I take, then he has this check. And now I have to move my king, and then he takes, and suddenly he won a pawn back, and now he's better. So I couldn't take, instead I played bishop e6 here, and now we traded, and he played rook f5, trying to block my queen from the defense of my knight, which would work, except there is one move that I had to find that kind of made him look silly, and that's g6. Because now if he takes, I can just take. And otherwise he's losing the rook, so he has to move it back. And now this looks like a free pawn, but you got to be careful when you're taking pawns when your pieces aren't very well positioned, and in this case he actually would have just had rook f3, rook h3, and my knight's kind of trapped. So I didn't get greedy. Instead, I played f5, gaining some space, and he played g4, trying to open up my king side. But here I found one of the nicest moves that I found all tournament, and that is the move knight e4. Jumping my knight into the center where it looks like it can be captured. But the problem for him is that if he takes, after this, it looks like he has me pinned, but actually now I have this discovered attack against his rook. And now I'm up material, his king is open. So he can't do that, but if he doesn't take, well, and moves his queen, for example, well, then I can take here, and then after this check, I have this check now. And now I have another discovered attack against the rook. So he was in a very dangerous situation. He took, and now I made a mistake. I played way too quickly. I was sort of just on autopilot. I took back the knight, not realizing that I had a much stronger move, which is actually queen takes a2. I could have just left this knight hanging here, because by taking, I'm actually threatening checkmate. And he has to block it with c3, and now I give a check, come back, and now I take the knight. And I won a pawn, and his king is in danger. And I also should mention that if you try to bring the knight back this way, and it looks like he's stopping mate, but now I take, and again, he's going to move his king. I'm going to check, and he's in big trouble. So this was a big missed opportunity, and I kind of started to tilt a little bit after this because I realized that I had let him off the hook. He just played rook b3, and even though I'm still up a pawn, he's just safer now. But I had to sort of compose myself and realize that I'm still better. I need to keep pushing. So here I brought another rook in the game. He still can't take the pawn because I have this discovery attack. He got his king out of the way, and now I just started to advance, and I realized that what I have to do is push this pawn. I mean, it's my main advantage in the position. This is how I'm going to win. So I push it, and actually here it looks like he can take, but what's going to happen is takes, and if takes, suddenly his back rank is exposed, and this is mate. So he played rook d3, trying to create a pin, and I just pushed the pawn. And now it's one square away from queening, except there's a rook in the way, so it's not so simple. And here he played h5, and already at this point, he had like 2 or 3 minutes. I had maybe 5 or 6 or so, and he's doing whatever he can to create counterplay. He's trying to bust open my king side. If he can at least get to my king, then maybe he can create a perpetual or something. So I had to defend and take, and now he brings his queen back, and I make sure the pawn is well defended. And already at this point, we were both like under 2 minutes, maybe even down to 1 minute. And so the remainder of this game is just being played very quickly. Very intense situation. He attacks the pawn. I go here to attack his queen. He goes back. I go back with my bishop. He goes g5 here. I go here with my queen. I wasn't really sure what to do. I mean, I obviously have him against the wall. I mean, he can't really move his pieces because he's has this protect against the pawn, but what do I do to break through? He attacks me, I go back, and now he picked off this pawn, which is objectively good, but it also kind of helps me, because now I go here, and I start to attack him on the queen side using the fact that the A file has now been opened. He goes b3 here, and in this position, I actually was completely winning, and there was a sacrifice that I needed to see, which I briefly saw, but I had like 40 seconds, and it would have just been impractical to go for it. But I can show you what that is, and that's the move rook takes a2. And it hangs the queen, but it can't be captured because there's this checkmate. And after king takes, what would follow is check, and now after king here, then there's another check, and now there's this stunning move c5, and white is actually getting checkmated because there's a threat of this and a threat of this. But at the same time, after this sacrifice, what I would have had to see is that he would have a check and another check, but then I just go here with my king and I'm completely safe. And after this, I take, and I'm completely winning here because his king is actually a lot more exposed than mine. But I didn't see that, and instead I just moved my queen back to e4. He went here, traded bishops, and now I went here. And at this point, he still had a chance to kind of save the game, but he had very little time and he blundered with queen to d4. Threat here that I had was queen to a3 check, followed by taking the pawn, but he actually could have played this move and allowed me to take, and then moved his queen up and started to do a lot of counter stuff, but he missed that chance and played here, allowing me to take his rook, and now he went here, hoping that he could create some threats with the rook and the queen, but with like 20 seconds on the clock, I found a clutch way to just simplify the game and not allow him any shot at counterplay, giving up the queen, but promoting to second queen, and now bringing the queen back. And now I create a pin, basically forcing a trade of queens, after which he would be down a rook. So in this position, he actually resigned. And I was able to get that clutch result, third win out of 3, to end day 1 on a perfect score. So now we're into round 4, the first round of day 2, and I'm actually going to pick this game up on the 17th move because this is a very long game. And what happened here was I sacrificed a pawn for some initiative, but I didn't play very precisely, and I kind of lost my attack a little bit. But this position objectively is about equal because he's up a pawn but is down in development. And what I should have done is simply kind of brought my rooks in, but already in this position, from a starting time control of 75 minutes, I was down to 20 minutes, he was down to 15. We both spent a lot of time through the opening and early middle game. And here I tried to go for an attack and play the move f6, trying to open the diagonal for my bishop, hitting here, but he simply covered with g6. And now I allowed him to take because I now attack with my rook. And he went back with the queen, which was sort of a mistake because now I got the move in bishop h6, actually forcing his queen to h8, where it definitely does not want to be. And here I followed up with queen f3, threatening mate on f7. He, of course, defends us with bishop e6. And now I played king b1 here, kind of sidestepping potential checks. He goes rook d8, and now I play h4. I'm just trying to use my kingside pawns to kind of rip open his position. He goes f6, and now I was already down to about 10 minutes, and I made a mistake. What I should have actually played was the move h5, but I thought that after this move I didn't really have a breakthrough, not realizing that I actually did, and here the move that basically would have won the game would have been rook takes e5, a crazy sacrifice that opens the position. And now there's actually a few ways to win. One of them is actually bishop f5, which now threatens to take and then go to f7. And if the bishop goes back, then I can actually go here. I mean, this would have been crazy. I'm not sure I would have found this even in a game where I had more time. But basically, I bring in my pieces, and black is totally paralyzed. I mean, he can't defend against the threat of queen takes here. So I was actually a lot closer to creating play than I realized, but I was kind of not sure what to do, and I played bishop f4 here. And now we trade pieces, but he's up 2 pawns, and he just kind of has to sit tight. And I just started pushing this pawn, so I could go here and have a constant threat looming of queen g7, so that his queen would always sort of have to guard. But now he starts to slowly kind of push back, and here he's threatening to play c5 and force my queen away from d4. So I played b4. And I was, again, not sure what to do. We kind of went around, traded rooks. I moved my king up. And slowly he started to consolidate his position. He moved his queen, kind of forced me out. I went back, and he went here. And now I played rook e1. I was honestly open to trading rooks here because I thought if I can at least dominate the e-file, then I have some chance. But he goes here, and I played rook f1, kind of perhaps threatening this sacrifice, but not really. And he goes here, and now I go here, and now he goes here, and I'm slowly getting suffocated. I had a lot of space, and suddenly I don't. I have to pull everything back, and he's threatening to now bring in his pieces and force some trades. And here I played here, which is just another bad move that made under time pressure. And he went here, offering a trade of queens, which I don't want to take because then I'm going into an endgame where I'm down 2 pawns and have very little hope. So I went here, but that's objectively even worse because now he played c4. And my bishop is actually trapped, but in this position, I didn't sit here and think. I immediately played this move, bishop takes f5. And even though this is a complete bluff, it kind of threw him off. And he only had a minute to calculate, and he believed that this was dangerous. Even though what he could have done was simply taken, and after I take, he can go here. And after this check, perhaps he thought that he was in a lot of danger, but really, even though his king is out in the open, I have no more checks. I bring my rook back, and he can even go here and then bring his bishop here and cover, and I'm just completely lost. But luckily, my bluff kind of worked, and he played here. And suddenly, we trade queens, and I bring my king back, and now he can't take my bishop because his rook is hanging, and he also can't take here because of this discovered check. Now I win the rook. So he brought his rook back, and I go here, and even though I'm down a pawn, I'm still in the game, and anything can happen. I end up winning another pawn. And now we trade bishops and go into this endgame, where it's about equal, but we both had a minute, and we both have to be super precise to not lose. And here he takes my pawn, I take his, and he, instead of taking the pawn, played here. And I thought that if I take, it would actually be a losing endgame for me because he has this pawn, but I didn't realize that I actually could have taken and then pushed my own pawn, and this is actually winning for white. But I didn't have time to calculate this, so I simply played here, defended, he took this pawn, but then I steal this one, and I bring my rook back, very important move to stop his pawn from advancing. And in this position, according to the engine, it's dead even, 0-0-0, but when we're both playing on super low time, mistakes are going to happen. And he brought his king in, I tried to bring in mine, and now I made actually a mistake. What I should have done was brought my king this way to keep it kind of centralized and close to the pawn. I thought that it'd be better to bring it towards my pawns, but now he starts to push, and I have to sacrifice the pawn to get my king through, and this was actually a mistake to go here. If he had just simply brought his rook back, then these pawns would have been next to impossible to stop, and I would have been borderline lost. But luckily for me, he also had low time and didn't play the most precise moves, and this was another mistake on his part, wasting time pushing this pawn when he should have been pushing these. And now I go through, come back and take this pawn, and now it's a race. I'm going to push my pawns, he's going to push his. Who's going to be faster? Well, objectively, once again, it should be even. But here, after I moved c4, he made another big mistake by actually playing this move g2. Because this move doesn't threaten anything, and he can't queen because I will just take. And what he should have done was pushed his other pawn, after which it would end up being a draw because he would queen, I would queen, and then he would just be able to make a perpetual using his queen, and if they're ever traded off, then my rook is just going to have to sacrifice itself for this pawn. But he made a big mistake with this move g2, and now I saw that I had a draw, but then I thought for a little and realized that I should have had a win. And I pushed c5, and now he had to bring his rook out because I was about to move my pawns in and take it. And now he goes here, and he tried to go for this little trick where he sacrifices his rook to distract it from this pawn, but I took. He made a queen, but now I go here. And he tries to make this pin, but now I just sidestep. And now check, and I promote. And he has no perpetual because I block, and very similarly to the last game, I force a queen trade, and now I promote, and it's not even close. I mean, I just take the pawn, and that's game over. And just like that, I was able to win this rook endgame in very, again, clutch fashion. But this game was a lot of luck. I mean, I should have just been lost in that early endgame with the rook and the bishop and the queen. But luckily for me, I kind of bluffed my opponent, and it paid off, and I was able to win. Now we're into round 5, the penultimate round of the tournament, and I was up against someone with a similar classical rating and also a similar online blitz rating. He was about 2,300 blitz on Lichess, where this tournament was played. And I knew this was going to be my toughest test yet. And again, I'm going to jump to the 17th move. Nothing really interesting happened in the opening. It was an English opening. We traded both knights, and now we're in this position where it's about equal. And here my opponent played the move g4, kicking my bishop back, but he's kind of exposing his king a little bit. And I brought my rooks over, and here my opponent played bishop d2, attacking the pawn, so I defended it. But now he played queen b3, which for some reason I just totally missed. And I went into a deep think here, and I found a very interesting idea, a very risky idea. Well, I mean, the logical thing to do would be to defend the pawn, right? By moving the rook back, but then I would be going in the wrong direction. Then I'm moving my rook back to where it came from, and then suddenly he's going to bring his other rook over, and then he's going to have the advantage. And here I realized that by committing his queen here, he's kind of leaving his king side a little bit vulnerable. And so I calculated a certain sacrifice, and after I thought about it, I decided to go for it. Bang. Bishop takes g4. The idea is that if he takes, I check, and now after king here, I bring in my rook, and suddenly I'm creating a lot of pressure here. If he brings his bishop back like this, then I can just take here, and I'm threatening mate. He has to block. Then I take, and take. I'm threatening the bishop. If he goes here, then I go here. I calculated all this, and it looked pretty good to me. But actually, he would have had a slight defense, and also I should mention that this block is the worst, because then I go here, check, and then I actually have mate, like this. But he actually had a defense that he would have had to see with the move here, queen to d1. And then after I go here to defend the rook, he can then play rook to f3. And then come back, and actually he's holding everything. And after a sequence of trades, we would get to a position where I have 3 pawns for a bishop, but because my pawns can't really be pushed yet, it's advantage to him. But he didn't see all that and played rook e1, attacking my queen. I go here, and now he played this move c5, a very nice discovered check. And also he now has a choice of 2 pawns that he can take, and I didn't see this coming at all. I thought that I was in big trouble now, because after here he takes, and now he's only 2 steps away from queening. But I realized here that I had to kind of go full throttle on the king side, and here I played rook e2, and after a trade he attacked my queen. I went back. He goes here, I go back, attacking his bishop. And now I found a sort of a clever idea. Maybe objectively not the best move, but I thought it was nice. Using the fact that I have this pin here, and also I was worried about this pawn coming, so I played the move bishop e5. Idea being that if he takes my bishop, then I can take the rook, and if he pushes, then I will take with check, and then bring the rook back, and now my queen and rook both guard the queening square. And obviously that means he can't take, so he pushes, but then I bring my bishop back, and now my bishop is very nicely blockading the pawn, while also maintaining pressure along this diagonal. And here he played queen b6, trying to get his queen more in the game, attack my pawns, but I simply played queen f6 defending, and he made a big mistake by taking this pawn, because this allowed me to go g5, and now I'm creating a lot of pressure against this pawn. And after he moves his queen, I take, and now I have a discovered attack lined up once I push. So he went here, we traded, and now I knew that I was like on the verge of winning, but we both had very little time at this point. I had like 5 minutes, he had like 1 or 2 minutes. And here I actually blundered. What I needed to do was get my queen to the e-file and then try to get to e2, but I played queen e6 instead of playing the move queen e5. And even though they look similar, the difference is with queen e6, he actually could have taken here. And after check, he then could have come back and blocked, and he would be winning. But he was in serious time trouble himself, and he didn't realize. And so he moved it back, allowing me to open this check. And now I brought the bishop in, and if he were to move back with the rook, then I can bring in my queen, and I'm threatening mate. So he gave up his rook to queen, but then I take, bring my rook back, walk my king in the corner, and go here, now threatening checkmate, and it's basically game over because he goes here, check, and rook f2. And he resigned because I'm winning his queen. And just like that, I was able to win another clutch game. This was probably the most intense game of the tournament. We were both under very serious time pressure, and I had to be accurate. And I wasn't exactly at every point, but luckily for me, I made more sort of accurate moves than my opponent, and I was able to win. So going into the final round, I was on 5 points out of 5, and essentially I already had the tournament in the bag because I was the only one on a perfect score, and there was a whole bunch of other people on 4. But Obviously, I still wanted to play the best possible game in the last game and at least get a draw. And I played the solid English opening and the four knights, what's called the quiet line with e3. And this is all pretty much theory. And now I go for knight d5. Idea being that if he takes my knight, I can take here, and I'm removing the defender of the e5 pawn. So he didn't take, he moved his bishop back, and now I go here, lining up an attack. Now if he does something careless, then I would take and then steal this pawn on h7. And the way to deal with this from black's perspective is simply to play the move h6, but he played the move g6, which now allows me to play h4, and now I'm threatening to go here and try to open the h-file. He played rook e8 here, and now I jumped in with knight g5, seeing as how it's kind of an outpost for the knight. If he ever goes here, then actually I can sacrifice here, because if he takes my bishop, then suddenly he's getting mated, and even if he takes the knight, he's in trouble, because I take this way, and the rook being super open, I have all this pressure, white is essentially winning. So the knight is untouchable. He has to develop in other ways. And now I slowly just developed and played bishop b2, and the fact that he walked his king onto this diagonal doesn't seem dangerous at first because there's all these pieces in the way, but it's going to prove a mistake. And here he played h5, and again, he's kind of softening the protection around his king, and now again, the knight is just sitting on a nice outpost square. So here I simply long castled. I was just playing it patient. At some point, I had a possibility to sacrifice my knight, but I didn't even need to win this game. So I was just being especially solid and trying to bait a mistake out of him, and it happened here. He took the knight, thinking that he could then try to win this pawn, but now I hit him with f4. And now the problem is I have all this pressure along the diagonal, and this pawn is only defended by this pawn, but this pawn is also defending the bishop. So now he goes here, but I take. And now if he takes the knight, this would lead to the opening of this diagonal, and black is in big trouble because I can even bring in my queen and try to checkmate. So he took, and now I brought my rook onto f1. You'll notice here that all my pieces are suddenly coming to life, whereas his pieces are all still kind of dead. And after a rook trade, I bring in my other rook, and already here I basically could have won the queen by doing this check, and then check, forcing him to give it up. But I saw this endgame and thought it's obviously good for me, but I could have done better. So I instead took here. And after takes, I take the bishop. And again, his pieces are super dead, super passive. He goes here, check. He has to give up the queen to save the knight, but now I take. And basically the game is over. I calculated basically here till the end. Check. He takes the bishop. I take the knight. Push, he has to give up the bishop to stop me from promoting, and he took the pawn carelessly without realizing that I now have a tactic to win the game. Check, and take the rook. And just like that, I won this game very smoothly and finished the tournament on 6 out of 6, clear first, picking up a nice cash prize as well. And yeah, this was my best tournament performance in a very long time, bouncing back from the poor performance that I had in the Pan Ams just a couple days before that. Just goes to show you sometimes it's just a question of form. And I mean, also the fact that it was a longer time control helped me. Didn't have to make so many quick decisions. But yeah, it was a great tournament. Can't say that I wasn't lucky at least a few times, but you know, chess sometimes is a game of luck too, not just skill. So hope you guys enjoyed that. Hope you can learn something from each and every game, and stay tuned for more chess content on the channel.